So good day everyone, I will be discussing the anatomical terms of motions in our body. The terms used assume that the body begins in the anatomical position like this. So let's begin the discussion. So flexion and extension are movements that take place within the sagittal plane and involve anterior and posterior movements of the body and limbs. First, the flexion and extension of shoulder and knees. This is an example of the movement. So the shoulder flexion is going in front upward, while the shoulder extension is going at the back upward with the help of the bones. Next is the knee flexion, going at the back upward, while the knee extension is going back to its anatomical position with the help of bones and muscles. Next is the flexion and extension of the neck. This is an example of the movement. The flexion of the neck is going in front downward of the body, while the extension of the neck is going at the back downward with the help of bones and muscles of the neck. Lastly, the flexion and extension of vertebral column. The flexion of the vertebral column is going in front downward of the body, while the extension of the vertebral column is going at the back downward with the help of bones and muscles that the body consists. That's all for the flexion and extension of shoulder, knees, neck, and the vertebral column. Abduction and adduction are motions of the limbs, hand, fingers, or toes in the coronal plane of movement. Regular movements, adduction, adduction, and circumduction of the upper limb at the shoulder. This is an example of the movement. When our both upper limbs at the shoulder, left and right, go upward with our bones and muscles, that is abduction. And if our both upper limbs at the shoulder, left and right, go back to its anatomical position with all muscles and bones, that is adduction. And lastly, when our left and right upper limbs at the shoulder going upward one by one while turning our whole body with the use of bones and muscles, that is circumduction. That's all for the abduction, adduction, and circumduction of the upper limbs. Medial and lateral rotation. Rotation describes movement of the limbs around their long axis. The medial and lateral rotation of neck and lower limbs. This is an example of the movement. When the movement of the neck and head turns right of the body, that is medial rotation. While the movement of the neck and head turns left, that is lateral rotation. When the movement of the right lower limb turns right, that is medial rotation. While the movement of the left lower limb turns left, that is lateral rotation. So that's all for the medial and lateral rotation of neck, head, and lower limb. Supination and pronation are movements of the forearm. In the anatomical position, the upper limb is held next to the body with the palm facing forward. an example of the movement. When the movement of forearm turn it downward, that is pronation. While your forearm turns back to its anatomical position, that is supination. That's all for supination and pronation of forearm. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion are movements at the ankle joint, which is a hinge joint. This is an example of the movement. When the upward movement of the ankle joint, that is dorsiflexion. While the downward movement at the ankle joint, that is plantar flexion with the help of the bones. So that's all for the plantar flexion and dorsiflexion of the ankle joint. Inversion and eversion are complex movements that involve the multiple plane joints among the tarsal bones of the posterior foot or intertarsal joints, and thus are not motions that take place at the ankle joint. This is an example of the movement. When the movement turning of the foot to angle the bottom of midline, that is inversion. While the movement turns the bottom of the foot away from the midline, that is eversion with the help of intertarsal joints. That's all for the inversion and eversion of the foot. Protraction and retraction are anterior and posterior movements of the scapula or mandible. This is an example of the movement. When the movement of mandible goes outside of the mouth, that is protraction. While the movement of mandible goes inside of the mouth, that is retraction. That's all for the protraction and retraction of mandible. Depression and elevation are downward and upward movements of the scapula or mandible. This is an example of the movement.
The upward movement of the shoulder is elevation, while the downward movement of the shoulder is depression.
Another example is when the downward movement of the mouth is depression, while the upward movement of the mouth is elevation. That's all for the depression and elevation of mouth and shoulder. Opposition and reposition, a pair of movements that are limited to humans and some great apes. These terms are applied to the additional movements that the hand and thumb can be performed in this species. This is an example of the movement. When the movement of the thumb and little finger toward each other with the help of the bones, that is opposition. While the thumb and little finger return to anatomical position, that is reposition. That's all for the opposition and reposition of little finger and thumb. Excursion is the side-to-side movement of the mandible. This is an example of the movement.
When the movement of mandible to the right and left of midline, that is lateral excursion, while the movement returning mandible to the midline is what we call medial excursion.
That's all for medial and lateral excursion of mandible.